had, exploding beneath Lysander in a splay of glistening red tentacles. They wrapped around Lysander and dragged him back, and suddenly every step forwards took an enormous force of will. Lysander tore one arm free and swung the fist of Dorn around him, but the blunt hammer did little against the tentacles. They bent under the force. It snapped around the hammer, too. So suddenly it felt like it weighed too much for Lysander to lift. Lysander roared in frustration. Bolter fire from his battle brothers was doing almost nothing. For every chunk of flesh they blasted out of Strassa was replaced as gore welled up in the wound and solidified. Sergeant Septurin sprinted through the chaos towards Strassa. Tentacles sprouted to grab him, but he slashed through them with his chainsword as he ran. One of Strassa's claws reached down for him, but he dropped and rolled under it, bringing his blade up as he passed under to slice it at a joint. It thudded to the ground behind him as he came back to his feet. "Whatever the hells you are," cried Septurion, "you will be no longer. This is the blade that ends you, assassin." Strassa's answer was a blade of bone that speared out from the center of her torso, from between the pulsing mass of her multiple hearts. It impaled Septurin through his stomach and split the backpack of his armor in two as it exited out his back. Sparks showered out of the armor's ruptured power unit. Septurin was still alive as Strassa lifted him off the ground. "Brother!" yelled Lysander, and the most awful feeling of all was the helplessness of being unable to move while a fellow Imperial fist was dying in front of him. Two new slimmer limbs grabbed Septurin by the arms. The blade twisted, forcing Septurin's torso wide open, and for a second Lysander could see Strassa's face through the hole in the assault sergeant. The blade withdrew, and Septurin dropped to the ground, by now dead. The thought of Septurin's muscle and bone being absorbed for Strassa's use was what spurred Lysander on. Tentacles snapped at him as he took another few torturous steps towards the assassin. Strassa looked at Cincella now, as if she had momentarily forgotten about the Grand Master. Cincella twisted in her grasp, her own unnatural strength fighting against the alien muscle that wrapped every part of Strassa's mutating skeleton. Strassa forced Cincella towards her chest, where her organs throbbed inside an open torso. Cincella twisted one arm free. A knife punched into the side of Strassa's hearts, and blood sprayed out, flowing from the assassin's chest as if from a fountain. The teeth slid from the edges of her open rib cage, forming a set of vertically hinged jaws that closed shut on lazy Cincella. Cincella's legs kicked as the teeth gouged into her waist. She was strong, and she lived a few seconds longer than anyone had a right to, bracing her arms against the side of the maw to hold it wide. Bones snapped and her arms gave way, and the jaws clamped shut on her. Lady Cincella's lower half flopped to the blood-soaked ground, still kicking. Strassa turned into Lysander, and new limbs, great bladed arms like those of a great fleshy mantis, grew from her shoulders. "Keep her here," ordered Lysander into the box. "If we can't kill her, keep her on Opus." Agent Skolt's next two shots were aimed upwards, towards the spacecraft still hovering overhead. Twin explosions bloomed against the rearward engines, and a plume of burning fuel poured out, plunging like a waterfall of flame, to the landing pad a few hundred meters away. The ship suddenly drifted to one side, secondary explosions bursting around the jet. Strassa looked up and saw the spacecraft, her way off this planet, was mortally wounded. Skolt's turbo penetrator shots had punched through a fuel tank or a coolant line, and one of the landing jets was shaking itself apart in bursts of promethium flame. Strassa broke and run. Her weapons were withdrawn, and suddenly long limbs, like those of a gazelle, were propelling her towards the embattled terminal building. The tentacles swelled into pools of blood, and Lysander was free. He ran towards Strassa, shouldering aside the dazed Aristia troops, too exhausted or confused to flee. He could not hear the whining, then the screaming of the spaceship's engines, as its remaining thruster failed to cope with the strain and sent the ship into a rapidly spinning descent. Gunfire crackled as Lysander reached earshot of the terminal, and he was aware of the other Imperial fist following him as he ran. His Terminator armor was not ideally suited for a foot pursuit. But once he had built up momentum, he could keep pace with the other Imperial fists, as Legend Strassa kept a burning barricade and vanished into the terminal building. Lysander smashed through the barricade, kicking away the sheets of steel reinforcement. Inside, gunfire hammered in every direction, filling the air with blurry chains of fire that rattled through the high girders. Sparks showered down as bullets and las bolts burst against the corroded bronze-plated walls, and smoke hung heavy. A pair of grayish vapor caught Lysander's throat. He felt his lungs contracting even as he registered the bodies heaping up around him, draped lifeless over the fallen bronze pillars and the deflated, unnatural attitudes of death. Imperial guardsmen and steel-plated heretics lay mixed with one another, their blood mingling in gory mounds of torn flesh. Lysander charged through friend and foe. Guardsmen huddling behind a fallen slab of wall were thrown aside as he stormed through them. A sweep of shield knocked two heretics aside. The guardsmen they were bearing down on had to scramble out of the way to avoid Lysander's boots crunching down on them. Legend Strassa was ahead, just visible through the bedlam. Men were flung aside as her long legs loped past. Las fire streaked around her. Lysander followed in her wake, just keeping pace as he ducked under a sunken section of the roof. She vaulted the remains of an interior wall. Lysander dropped a shoulder and barged through it, throwing bricks and mortar outwards like an exploding grenade. The battle was not his. The men of the Aegol Seabreakers would have to fight and die without Lysander's aid. Lysander glimpsed the huge armored figure and recognized with a lurch that it was a space marine, not a fellow soldier of the Imperial, but of the traitor legions, his armor smoldering with inner fire, gnarled and smoking, like the outcrops of a living volcano. In one hand, the traitor marine held up an Imperial Guard officer, a colonel by the throat. Flames were already licking around the officer's throat. Under the traitor marine's feet was a regimental standard, the face of the saint embroidered, stained with blood and filth. At any other time, the obscenity of a space marine would be met with Lysander's every attention. Any other time. But not this time. The enemy was Legend Strassa. She had to die. Even the matter of honor that a traitor marine represented was relegated to second place, to the only victory that mattered on Opus. The hand around the officer's throat had 6 fingers. Lysander knew he was looking at Carnival, champion of the Blood God, who had marched alongside Angron and the cursed in the black days of the Horus Heresy. A section of the roof collapsed up ahead, showering twisted metal and masonry down on Lysander's path. He dropped down and vaulted to keep from being buried. "We will return!" he yelled at the marine. "We will find you, and all will be repaid." In reply, Carnical's 6 fingers snapped the colonel's neck and dropped the body into the dust. He stamped on the man's torso, grinding his bones and organs into the defaced standard. In reply, Legend Strassa had stopped too, on the other side of the fallen roof section. Her legs were fusing together into sturdy supports, banded around with muscle, and her forelimbs were now great shovel-like wedges of bone. Her expression did not change as she rammed them to the ground ahead of her, tearing up the floor and revealing a deep hole beneath her. Lysander scrabbled over the rubble. Men from both sides were trapped under him, still yelling. As he watched, Legend Strassa opened a hole just big enough for her swollen form, and forced her way down, into the hole and out of sight. Lysander reached the edge of the hole. Wetness shone beneath him, and in the red flashes of las fire. He jumped down and landed, hit deep in the rushing water. No, not water, fuel. Legendstrasse had found one of the fuel lines that ran under the spaceport. The stench of it was so great an unaugmented man would not have breathed it at all. Lysander could hear Legendstrasse splashing and slithering up ahead. He glimpsed fish-like, scaled masses, writhing away into the darkness. He ran after her, forcing his way against the flow. Legendstrasse left bony spikes in her wake, embedded in the side of the pipe. Lysander kicked them aside and knocked them away with his hammer. A web of stringy membrane clung to him, but he ripped it aside and wrenched the worst of it out of his eyes. He was closing on her. A muscular tail was powering her forwards, and she had absorbed so much biomass that she was scraping along the sides of the pipe. She was shedding bony spurs and lashes of muscle, edged with teeth, that slashed at Lysander as he ran, but did not slow him down. His Terminator armor and the ornament of the shield and hammer meant he was a soldier built to charge on and not slow down, no matter what was thrown at him. Fire sparked behind him. Lysander caught it in the corner of his eye, and risked a glance behind him. Carnicle's six-finger was leading down the hole, illuminating the section of pipe with molten fires of his armor. He reached down with a six-fingered hand and shone into the darkness, liquid ceramite dripping from a slash in his palm. The molten metal hit the torrent of fuel. Lysander saw the flames as if slow motion, liquid fire billowing up towards him, the fuel torrent vaporizing in a flash of boiling flame. Lysander threw his shield up in front of him as the impact hit him, and the shield slammed into him with the force of a battering ram. He heard the biological screech of Legendstrasse ahead of him, but saw nothing. Instead of the fire, there was darkness. Then the scream was ringing out of the bedlam in his ears, and by the time he slammed into the crumbling rockcrete of the fuel pipe, he was able to feel nothing at all. The rituals of Kazeo, more than 2 weeks after the first Imperial Guard troops went in, became rooted in the minds of the men. One never went into any underground structure, even a half-collapsed cellar, or a sunken maintenance shed alone. Ever. Enough had been devoured by fist-sized fleshy spiders, or had shot themselves for no reason, or simply vanished. Each day before sunrise, almost every soldier who was able wrote a request to the Emperor on whatever he had to hand. A page torn from a field manual, a shard of metal shrapnel, and buried it in the rubble dust that choked Kazeo's streets. It was a tradition of one of the Imperial Guard regiments that had caught on. Most of them simply asked to see the next sunrise. Some begged for one confirmed kill that day, so that when they went to the rider's, so when came the rider's own death, he would have at least balanced it against the stolen life of an enemy. A few asked for a hated officer to fall in the line of battle, and before he fed any more of his men into the choke-killing alleys and the lightless underground warrens. A few drops of water were allowed to fall on the ground before drinking. No matter how, boots were blessed every morning, because if you lost your boot, you were sure to die that day. Sergeant Salithus of the Imperial Fists was watching one of those rituals now, being enacted among the Imperial Guardsmen sheltering in foxholes and waist-deep trenches, dug into the southern end of the Garden of Estria, the comely. This great pleasure garden stretched for whole city blocks on each edge, and before the battle had been sculpted a landscape in miniature, with summer houses and follies and ornamental lakes separated by strands of trees. False temple ruins had stood on low hills, to be enjoyed by the Aristia and wealthy craftsmen who lived in the exclusive housing blocks overlooking the garden. Now it was a grotesque scar, an open wound where torn earth replaced shattered buildings, where the remnants of the place's forced beauty served only to make it all the more ugly. The firing lanes across the garden were all but impossible to avoid, so the guardsmen who held its southern third dug themselves to the ground, crawling onto their bellies to keep out of sight of snipers who occupied the shattered habitation blocks overlooking the northern reaches. They were dilutions, a mixture of the 120th and the 309th, with a few squads of the 122nd stormtroopers. A few thousand men crouched in ones and twos as gray dawn broke through the pall of smoke and rubble. The ritual was the confession. Only a couple of priests remained, so men too wounded to fight, but still able to move, had taken up the spiritual slack. They went from trench to foxhole, hearing the sins of the day. Everyone had something to confess. If you didn't, the Emperor would forget about you, and his grace would not save you from a sniper's bullet or booby trap. I lived when my friends did not. I killed a man, but I do not know if he was a friend or an enemy. I let my lasgun run dry, and did not realize until the firing had stopped. I was too afraid to move, and lay there all through the night. There were no punishments demanded by the makeshift confessors. If there was a punishment, the Garden of Estrina, the comely, would have surely been generous in handing it out. Selethus watched through his visor. Alongside the hatch of the Vindicator siege tank. His three-strong squadron was sheltered as much as possible in a series of artillery craters that had scoured one corner of the garden. His tank was the Beast of Marden, and the battle brothers of his squadron manned the Granite Fang, and the Bone Cracker. Trajak here, came a voice over the squadron box. The time is close, Lieutenant, said Selethus. Glory does not wait for us. She drives on. Though I do not share your enthusiasm, Sergeant, said Lieutenant Trajak. We are close. The rearward squads are getting into position. The word will be given as soon as they hear we are ready. Selethus had not seen Trajak's face, but knew the stormtrooper was the de facto commander in the garden. I can feel it in the teeth of my tanks, said Selethus. They grind in frustration. The longer I hold them back, the wilder they will be. They will yearn to charge forward, and their shots will be ill-aimed. As long as my men can see them, said Trajak. That will do as much damage to the enemy as your guns. I fear many of these men will not advance unless they see the Imperial fist alongside them. Your fear is failing, replied Selethus. If your men see it, they too will be afraid. But if you show no fear, they will forget, in the chaos of battle, what fear is. Voices chattered over the Vox. Acknowledgement messages flashed in rapid regimental code. Through the vision blocks, Selethus could see a tattered standard being unrolled. It was carried by a man who had lost one hand and most of his other arm, but he now served by carrying the standard and the crook of his remaining elbow. It was the standard of the 309th Dilution Lancers, and carried the emblem of a warhorse in full gallop, with a dozen battle armors named underneath. We're set. This is the general advance. All units, this is the general advance. Trajak's voice was over the Vox. Onwards, ordered Selethus. The Beast of Marden ground forwards on its tracks, riding up over the sodden sandbags that crowded against the sniper fire. The Vindicator's driver, Brother Morsk, was almost hidden by the huge breech of the tank's siege cannon, and Tech Marine Dadalian, the squadron's engineer, was crushed in the rear of the tank, in the space between the cannon's huge shells. Morsk swung the tank around so it showed its front dozer blade to the direction of the enemy. The Imperial Guard jumped from cover and advanced. Few of them ran. Officers held swords high and led the way, walking out across the chewed-up mud and chattered tree stumps. A pair of sentinel scout walkers strode towards one flank, surrounded by the incongruous jungle world camouflage of the stormtroopers. Sniper fire took the first toll. Men's heads snapped back as they fell, left where they were by the advance. Others were cut down and wounded but not killed, and their cries mixed with the battle oaths. Selethus' squadron was some way behind the front rank of men, and he saw through the vision blocks as gunfire took ones and twos, then handfuls. A preacher continued to shout the words of the Emperor's scribes, even when the men around him had all been cut down, and a few ears could hear him. A Delutian guardsman was shot through the abdomen and slumped down against the dry fountain, alongside bodies that had lain there for days. The enemy were concealed along the hard cover around the north of the garden. The snipers were huddled along false ruins and summer houses, or concealed on the banks of ornamental lakes. Others, no one could be sure of their numbers, occupied the buildings that stood almost completely intact along the northern edge, or held the streets that terminated at the garden's boundaries. Seleucus thought he could see movement up ahead, almost hidden by the drifting smoke and kicks of mud and blood from the sniper shots. He hauled open the hatch above his head, and the damp, smoky air of the battlefield filled the beast of Mardin. Snipers were cowering along the statue of Strina the Comely, and beyond the torn-up section of low hillside, studded with falsely aged fallen pillars and archways. They wore calls with gas masks over their heads. Cables from the masks hooked up to gas bottles strapped to their backs. They carried hunting rifles, perhaps looted from the armories of the Aristian nobles. Even as Seleucus watched, they were lining up shots among the advancing imperial guards. Astrina's statue, shoulders imperious, beautiful, swathed in furs and jewels. Now she was so pocked with bullet scars, it looked like her skin was sloughing off her. "Firing! Brace for recoil!" shouted Seleucus. He fulfilled 3 roles in the beast: squadron commander, tank commander, and gunner. He slammed a fist against the control stud beside him, and a shell was rammed into the gun's breech. The barrel of the gun was a short, wide mouth protruding beyond the dozer blade. Auto senses built into Seleucus' armor projected a likely firing trajectory into his retina. But in case those failed, the simple iron sights mounted on the commander's hatch told the same story. The firing line intersected with the shape of Astrina the Comely, and Seleucus yanked the firing lever. The cannon bellowed. Seleucus could see the dark streak of the shell carried by its long line of burning propellant. It slammed in the base of the statue, and the snipers disappeared in a cloud of torn earth. The report followed a moment later, a deep boom rumbling through the earth. Astrina toppled sideways, disappearing in the smoke and debris. Through the darkness, the enemy were charging. "They're here!" came Trajak's voice over the Vox. "Why didn't they wait? They're counterattacking!" Trajak switched to the Vox channel, linking to the Imperial Guard units. "All units! Fix bayonets and assault! Charge, Guardsmen, charge!" The enemy soldiers were emerging from the gloom of the Vindicator's shot. There seemed to be hundreds of them, suddenly appearing in the garden's northern expanses, as if they had been waiting for the guard to cross a line. They were hooded and masked, surrounded by a pall of green-gray smoke that bled from the gas bottles and breathing masks they wore. "The enemy is eager for death," came a vox from Brother Calistar, commander of the Granite Fang. "Too eager," said Seleucus. "They are vermin, but they are cunning. They had hard cover, but they abandoned it, just as we walked to the teeth of their guns." "Is it another sacrifice?" asked Tectomarine Deadland. "As the Sanctifier witnessed. They will not kill their own," said Seleucus. "So I think not. Squadron, support the advance, fire at will." The Vindicators hurled booming artillery shells at the host of the enemy troops. Whatever they had once been, the enemy had long ceased to suffer the doubts and fears of human beings. Explosions threw clouds of torn bodies into the air, but they still advanced. Lasfire shredded the front ranks, but they did not turn. They seemed more intent on a suicidal advance than the guard had been a few moments before. The beast of Mardin bucked as it fired, roaring plumes of flame across the battlefield. Among the detonations, Lasfire streaked back and forth across the guard and the enemy, and the battlefield was a mad cauldron that even a Space Marine's experience could not make sense of. It was without reason or purpose, as if this bedlam were in its own reward. It was chaos. The ground shuddered and split open. 100 guardsmen fell, and a fissure ripped across the gardens. A vast torrent of torn earth swept the black gash underfoot. Everything tilted sideways. The entire garden of Strina the Comely sank several meters. Nearby buildings collapsed, and the banks of dust rolled like the dense thunderclouds. Suddenly, Selethus could barely see anything beyond the dozer blade of his tank. Back, back, he ordered. Turn us around. They are beneath us. Morsk wrenched the controls around the beast's tracks and spun in opposite directions, slewing the tank around even as the ground tilted beneath it. Selethus could see the bone crackers sliding with masses of earth, pouring into the fissure that was rearing closer with every moment. Guardsmen were running in every direction, yelling for their squad mates or just sprinting away from the worst of the insanity. A sentinel walker limped past, one of its legs almost too badly twisted to support it. Trajak! Called Selethus into the Vox. The only reply was static, shot through with gunfire and screaming. The beast of Marden was losing its fight against gravity. The tracks were spinning through loose earth. Selethus pulled the hatch closed over him and crouched down beside the breech of the siege cannon. If they wish to fight their battle beneath the earth, shouted Selethus over the tearing fissure, then we shall fight the battle and win it, for we shall march to hell, if the enemy halts there and faces our guns. The ground dropped out from under the beast of Marden. For a second it was weightless as it lurched. Then the sides boomed as debris hammered against it and finally landed with an awful crunch. Selethus was rattled against the sides of the tank, drumming into the breach and the side of the hull. Its head swam, and the tank seemed to scream, its engine still grinding its tracks against the loose debris beneath it. Morse got himself upright and cut the engine. "Report!" said Selethus. "I am unhurt," said Daedalin. "The machine spirit is anguished." Selethus looked through the vision blocks, but he could not see anything but a coating of grime. He opened the hatch, and the earth showered in. The forces of Khazael had indeed decided to fight this battle beneath the ground, for they had built hell underneath the garden. Naked, writhing bodies, knitted together in an appalling tangled mess, formed a landscape that stretched off into the darkness. The sky of raw stone overhead was hung with tree roots, reaching down from the garden, the faintest light glistening in the expanses of skin from the tears on the ground. The sound of the breathing was like a whistling wind, rising and falling, and the smell was awful, a mixture of sweat, blood, and odor. Guardsmen, some living, some dead, lay among the bodies, the conscious trying to disentangle themselves from the limbs that suddenly surrounded them. Selethus could see men and women in there, all skin hues and sizes, scrawny arms wrapped around pallid guts, and no sign of the ground beneath the mass. "My sword!" said Selethus. Morsk pulled Selethus' chainsword from its scabbard near his feet and passed it up to the sergeant. "They have built a vision of the war beneath Khazael," said Selethus. "They have made a hell of the wretched from this world. So give thanks, for Dorn taught us to fight in hell." The guardsmen were crying out as they sank into the smothering mass. Others had been wounded in the battle or the fall and wailed like animals. They had reached for the beast of Marden, as if swimming against the current, but the blind grasping hands held them back. "Brothers, do you hear me?" "Granite Fang here," came the reply from Brother Kalistar. "We have thrown a track and cannot move. Brother Velian is hurt, but not badly. I see the bone cracker. They have come down on the roof. I cannot raise them on the Vox." A long, low trumpeting sound echoed across the underground landscape. The gloom would have been impenetrable to a normal man's vision, and Selethus could barely make out the movement in the distance. Picking their way across the layer of living bodies were monstrous forms, 3 or 4 of them, towering to the earthen ceiling on long stilt-like limbs. The fleshy bags of their bodies supported drooping heads, with long proboscis that poked and groped along the bodies, occasionally snatching one up, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps to feed. The lowing sound was emanating from these enormous creatures, and around their spindly legs scampered smaller things, indistinct structures of flesh. "Do you have a visual on that? Aye, Sergeant, replied Calistar. Can you fire upon them? Not unless they come closer, into our line of fire. Throne knows what they are. The works of the enemy, said Selethus. By such works we shall know them. Morsk, take us into firing range. Forwards, and right 20. The beast of Marden crunched through the bodies around it, tracks slurping through the sucking murk of churned bodies. Blood spattered against Selethus. The beast's targeting still worked, and the vectors lined up, lighting an outline for the closest beast as they came into range. Selethus let another shell slam into the breach. The beast was eager to recognize the sound, its head turning towards the Vindicator. Selethus could see the eyes dotted on its head, scattered asymmetrically around its trunk. It was made of bodies. They had lost much of their definition, as if melted or partly dissolved, but torsos and limbs were still just visible along the wrinkles of its sagging body. Recall, my brothers, the parable of Rhodegar, said Selethus. Though he fought from within a predator tank, he carried with him always his chainsword, and always gave it the greatest honors when it came to his weapon rights. Selethus fired, and the Vindicator's cannon roared. The corresponding blast boomed in the middle of the beast's torso, and its legs buckled, as it let out a terrible bleak trumpeting. Torn flesh showered down. Purplish fire tore from the massive wound, spraying down at the massed bodies. An unnatural light, in colors that could not properly be comprehended by a human eye, bled in every direction, and reality seemed to twist, twitching in response to the sudden burst of energy. And his battle brothers mocked him, continued Selethus. Brother Rodrigar, they cried. Why place such trust in a blade, when the might of the war machine protects you? The remains of the beast's torso split open. Instead of a ragged hole, the space was filled with swirling purple flame, boiling and flashing with power. More fire vomited out in a waterfall, carrying half-formed bodies, indistinct and quivering. They're warp portals, said Calistar over the Vox. Living doors of the warp. They're breeding them down here. But Rodrigar, said Selethus, his train of thought unbroken, listen not. He polished the teeth of his chain blade, and communed with the machine spirit of its motor. And came time, his predator tank joined battle against the liars that men called Eldar. The half-formed things uncoiled and struggled the surface of the human mass. They were misshapen and asymmetrical, crowned with malformed horns. Their skin tore and bulged as their lopsided faces were twisted with the agony of their sudden birth. Demons! Hissed Morsk. Throne above us! Hell's below! Demons spill from the Immaterium! Recall, Morsk, the parable, said Selethus, and act accordingly. The beast of Marden lurched forwards, bodies crunching. It rode up over knots of bodies and down again. The eyes of the other warp gate beasts turned to fix on it. Blood and gore were sprayed up the sides of the tank as Selethus wiped blood from the eyepiece of his helmet. Then, continues Selethus, the Xenos crippled Rodrigar's predator with an alien weapon of deceitful design. The war machine was laid low, its mighty tracks torn, its engine weeping clouds of oily smoke. The alien sought to breach the war machine and defile its machine spirit. But face to face, they came with Rodrigar. The beast of Marden crunched closer to the warp gate. Liquid fire was now lapping at his front armor, carrying on a tide of charred and disintegrating bodies, as well as formed demons. The mewling demon things were raking at the tank with their claws, trying to grab a handhold and drag themselves onto it. Selethus fired again, and the blast from the cannon shredded the demons, clustering the front of the tank. The shell detonated knee-high to the beast, and it fell, the torn warp gate plunging into the sea of plunging bodies. And Rodrigar despaired not, for he had honored his humble blade with the same fervor as the war machine, and it served him now, For while the war machine was lame and weakened, the blade did not falter. Selethus leaned out the hatch and speared one demon through the neck with his own sword, the chain teeth shredding the glowing demon's flesh. They were translucent, their organs squirming under the transparent skin, and they howled as they reached there blindly for the tank. The tank pitched up against the tightly packed mass of bodies. It lurched down again, as Selethus was face to face with the fallen beast. Its glassy black eyes rolled to stare at him. The massive wound on its side looked out into a boiling starscape, a window into another realm. It sought to drag Selethus's eye to stare into it, but it was a fragment of the warp, and to be lost in it was to invite madness. The weak-willed would walk simply into it. The stronger might have their minds simply haunted by what they saw there. Glimpses of the future or past, carefully poised lies, wrought to drive them mad, or turn them on their own. Selethus focused on the gate beast instead, even as its trunk split open to reveal rows of tooth-like barbs, reaching up into a wet, slurping gullet. "With every thrust, ahead!" cried Selethus. He hacked left and right at the demon trying to clamber up to him. He cut through a hand, bisected a skull. The demons were barely enough in cohesion to remain a physical form, and they fell against the blade, or were ground against the tank's tracks. Another meter closer, and Selethus was within striking range of the beast. With every slash, a life laid low before the Emperor's wrath, and when his brothers came to reclaim it, the shattered war machine, Rodrigard heaped up around it a host of alien dead. Selethus leapt onto the top of the hull and rammed the chain blade down into the warp gate beast's head. It punched in through one eye and emerged from the orifice formed by its split trunk. Blood sprang from the whirring teeth. He twisted back and forth, retching deeper the gristle and brain. The thing's eyes rolled back and bulged, oozing pale gore as the brain matter behind them was pulped. The whole beast spasmed. Flashes like lightning burst from a warp portal, and like breaking glass, cracks of power crazed across the portal surface. Selethus tore the blade free. "This ends the parable of Rodrigar." "We're bogged down," said Morsk. "Any deeper and we won't get out." "Take us back, brother. Reverse all speed. We have struck what blow we can. The chapter must know of the enemy's works here." The beast of Marden forced its way backwards, through the tide of burning bodies. More demons clawed at it, their bodies being forced into the track housings and shredded. Like a sea monster breaching the surface, the warp gate beast erupted back into the burning mass. It bellowed, spraying gore from its ruined head, power pouring uncontrolled from its open wound. It loomed up on torn and broken legs, high above the beast of Marden, dedicating its last moments to crashing down on the tank and crushing Selethus, who was halfway back at the commander's hatch. The roar of a siege cannon broke through the howling of the demons. The shell slammed in the face of the beast and blew it back, shattering into a rain of shredded meat and bone. Selethus threw himself flat on the tank's hull, as gore splattered down over him. He wiped the back of his gauntlet across the faceplate to reveal the bone cracker behind him, riding up over the knotted bodies. Its siege cannon smoldered from the shot it had fired. The shot had blasted the stricken warp beast into bloody chunks. Brother Kalistar clung to the tank's upper hull, and Brother Dees, commander of the Bone Cracker, stood in the commander's hatch, shooting down the clambering demons with his bolt pistol. "Brothers!" cried Selethus to the box. "The Bone Cracker yet lives! These demons you set free," came Driss's reply. He had to shout, for his tank's comms no longer worked. "They did us the honor of turning us right side up, and my brothers from the Granite Fang begged a ride. My thanks will have to wait until we are free of this place," said Selethus. "Take us back, drivers! Find a way up and away. Lysander must learn of this." The two Vindicators made better headway, now through the bodies, as the demons writhed, blind and ill-coordinated, with the shock of the warp gate's implosion. The beasts were lowing and stampeding at random in the distance, the fires of the warp dying down. The warp gate glimmered out, its last energies bleeding into the grazing pace of the warp gate beasts. In those last moments, narrowed eyes stared from the other side. Hungry demons denied their feast. But they were content to wait a little longer. They would not stay hungry for long.